You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Land. This podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts Tiffany Cruikshank and Katya Bach as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness.
The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.
Hello and welcome, or welcome back to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. Today I have with me returning guests Diament and Valerie Knopik PhD. We are about to kick off a brand new online version of the Yoga Medicine 200-hour teacher training, and it just felt like a really good excuse, to be honest, for the three of us to get together and have a bit of a chat. So Dana, welcome back to the Yoga Medicine Podcast.
Thanks for having me on here again, Rachel. Pleasure to be back.
And Valerie, welcome back.
Thank you. I'm super excited to be back with the two of you and chatting about the Yoga Medicine 200.
Woohoo! We thought we would focus on the topic today of controversial yoga cues, because it's something that we cover a lot, not just in our 200-hour, but in everybody's 200-hour, how to talk people into and through poses. But the second you graduate, and I don't think this is just my experience, the second you graduate, you are bombarded by articles like 10 things yoga teachers should never say again, or 5 outdated yoga cues. And I have now collected such a long list of things that I can never say again that it's a wonder that I talk as much as I do when I teach classes. Somehow I manage still. So I think it's not just a challenge for me, it's a challenge for most teachers and maybe for students as well. And so I thought it was worth a conversation that's not just never say this, only say this, but where we delve into the cues with a little bit more nuance and maybe we explore some opposing points of view as well. Let's just get straight into it, shall we? I'll let you start with the first one. Dana, take it away.
All right, so our first cue that we're talking about today is anterior core cues. So one of these examples might be something like navel to spine, or engage your core, or cinch your waist. So we know the core is really important to use in our yoga practice. And something like navel to spine, and as I mentioned, the anterior core cues tend to focus on just the front layer of the core. And the core is really three-dimensional. So we want to be able to tap into it, not just from the front, but also the side and the back, and really create this three-dimensional connection to the core. So a lot of times when we hear navel to spine as a student, if we don't understand this concept of three-dimensional core, we might only be engaging through the rectus abdominis, that the six-pack muscle that we all have.
somewhere underneath the layers over the top.
Yeah. And what happens is we might then come into flexion of the spine, or that sense of kind of rounding forward and really overly engaging the front side of the body, which then might restrict our breathing. So it's not so effective, or perhaps, we lose efficiency of the breath and all the layers of the core working together. I think it's a really popular cue because it's really easy to say. It's quick, and a lot of times you need cues that are not wordy. You need to be able, if we only have a few breaths in a pose, and we'll probably see this theme come up as we discuss all of the other cues, is that being able to speak efficiently and quickly is really important sometimes, but it really misses all the nuances of, the rest of the core. So is it wrong or bad? Not necessarily, if your students know that when you say navel to spine, you don't just mean, engage your rectus abdominis and do a crunch and flex and, lose your neutral spine. And if they know that it also encompasses the other layers of the core, then sure, that cue might work. But it can, I've seen in my experience that usually it leads you towards the breath being restricted and missing out on the deeper layer, the transverse abdominis, which is one that we really want to be able to use because we can use it really anytime, anywhere. It's not movement dependent. So for me, I prefer to use perhaps I really like the visual metaphor of thinking about like a piece of rope that's all the way around, or a belt. I like to say, imagine a belt getting one notch tighter and setting that up in the beginning of the class, say maybe for some core work, so that the students understand, okay, we're not just going from the front, but we also want to feel this drawing in and lifting up in all directions. And so then once you sort of paint the picture or you teach your students what you mean, then things perhaps like engage your core is quick and they know. But without that foundational understanding, it can perhaps lead some students astray. What do you think about that, those cues?
I use that one all the time, so I'm glad that you were kind in the way that you spoke about it. But I use it specifically when I want that rectus abdominis engagement, a sort of a hollow front body, a slightly rounded low back. So that's when I tend to use that one specifically, when I really want people to feel anterior core engagement.
Nice.
Yeah. I tend to use the kind of rope or belt mentality, and I also set it up at the beginning of class, almost before we even do anything. I kind of do like that demo of, here's a place that we're going to be going during class today, and I'll be using these cues a lot, and here's what I mean. And I have the class kind of envision that, even using their hands like this and putting it around their waist and just finding that gentle kind of cinching in and feeling how that lengthens, and also encourages that 3D community effect of the core. But I have been known to also say navel to spine in a pinch and things like that. So cinch in around the waist. But it is so important, I think, and valuable for the students to be able to visualize that, because then you're empowering them to also be able to feel that, it's that kind of mind-body connection when we set up that. I love how you said, Donna, that 3D kind of three-dimensional space. And if they can envision that, I think that also is so potent and helpful.
And I think it really just depends on what your theme is for the class, which words feel the most relevant. You could hug the midline, you could be strong in your center, you could draw in around the center. There's lots of different ways to say it. And maybe
corset.
Yeah, the corset. Maybe that's the thing, is just not being tied to one specific core cue, but just kind of picking and choosing depending on what you're trying to emphasize that day or what you'd like people to visualize. And you never know what's going to land with somebody.
And being able to watch your students too, because you could say navel to spine, and if you're seeing the intended result, then great. That really works. So there's one, being clear on what you mean and what you're trying to teach, and then seeing that your students understand as well.
Yeah, I think that's the ultimate, and we'll probably come back to that time and time again. Like, it doesn't actually have to be accurate if it works. If it's communicating your intention, tick, done, move on to something else. Thank goodness, takes a bit of the pressure off. The next one we had is actually somewhat related. It's flat back. This is one that I'd like to talk about because it's kind of like navel to spine. It's just a really quick way of expressing an idea. It's not really anatomically accurate. We tend to hear it in places where we want students to move from or create a neutral spine. And I've put that in inverted commas for those of you who are just listening and can't see my little inverted comma marks, because what we're talking about when we talk about a neutral spine is not just your day-to-day posture. It's a deliberate anatomical action called axial extension, where you're thinking about the crown of the head getting a little bit more lifted or a little bit further away from the base of the pelvis, but without squashing the natural curves of the spine. And I think that's the big controversial aspect of flat back, is students tend to know what it means. It's a quick way of communicating not a rounded spine, not a back bend. But natural spines do have curves in them. And sometimes you'll hear students who've kind of picked up the flat back cue and internalized it to say, oh, I've got terrible lordosis. Lordosis just meaning a back bend in your lumbar spine or the back of the waist. Well, everybody has lordosis. And there's just some debate about how much is normal or natural and how much is hyperlordosis. Or I've had people say to me, oh, I've got terrible kyphosis. Kyphosis meaning a rounding forward of the thoracic spine, the part that attaches to the rib cage. Again, totally normal. Everybody has that. It's just about how much is normal for you, and is that hyperkyphosis or just a regular amount. So that's the real crux of the flat back cue. We use it when we want students to have a flat back, a neutral spine that's deliberate. So you might think about a halfway lift in a sun salutation, or say you're sitting upright in Dandasana and you're about to hinge forward at your hips. We might say flat back, hinge at the hips. And then depending on what our intention is, they might then round their spine later. So kind of like navel to spine, not strictly accurate, but it might still work for your students. And it really comes down to what language they're used to, what it means to them. But I guess we do have to be careful that we're not giving them the impression that a healthy back is flat, that a healthy normal back doesn't have any curves. It's just a straight line like a rod, which is not the case. So some of the alternatives that I might use, depending on the position, if it's a halfway lift, I might say reach the crown of your head away from your sit bones, or draw your shoulder blades back and down, or brighten your chest. Because I'm thinking about the tendency there for gravity to kind of sit on the head and shoulders and round the spine. What cues could I give that would counter that rounded spine? Shine your chest forward, or brighten your chest, or broaden your collarbones. And sometimes I'll even say it'll feel like a back bend, because you really do have to engage the muscles on the back of your body to lift you out of the natural rounding there to find something that's more neutral. If it's a seated forward fold, I might say sit tall, or reach through the crown of the head, hinge forward at your hips. So for me, the cues that I use really tend to vary based on what their orientation to gravity is and what other body parts I could talk to that would be the most helpful. What do you both think about the flat back cue? Is it something that you use, never use?
This is one I don't often use. For whatever reason, it's just not in my repertoire of things that I tend to say. But I do agree with you that I love how you said, you teach differently depending on their orientation to the floor and the posture that you are moving them from or into. I also think that this one, if it's misinterpreted, I should say, could encourage a sense of rigidity around the spine that I don't think that we want to encourage, right? We want the spine to be able to move in all directions and to be able to support that movement. And so I don't tend to use it, but that doesn't mean it's a bad because it's a wrong thing. It's just one that I just don't tend to use.
What do you think, Dana?
This is a cue that I used a lot in my sort of earlier days of teaching. And as a student, it held a really great visual for me in that halfway lift. I don't think I really ever use it going from seated into a forward fold. I probably talk more about lengthening the spine, brightening the chest type of things. But in a sun salutation, coming into halfway lift, in my early days of teaching, I definitely used flat back a lot, all the time, probably, I'd say. And I actually remember being at the yoga medicine spine training for the very first time and learning about the curves of the spine, and my mind was blown. It's like, wait, what?
It's funny when you look back, isn't it?
I felt this sense of like, oh gosh, like I've been teaching people to try to like get rid of those curves without knowing that maybe that's what, the interpretation of flat back cue is. But I remember thinking that it was an effective cue because you're coming usually from, say, Uttanasana or, standing forward fold, and you're in that rounded spine. And you see so many students come into halfway lift keeping, as you said, Rachel, that the thoracic and spine rounded and curved. So I always felt like it was just a great visual to create in students' minds. So I'm not opposed to that cue as long as there's some education around that your spine does have curves in it.
Yeah, I agree. And I love the fact that Valerie pulled out that it can give people this feeling of the spine as kind of this immovable rod, like it's really important to keep it sort of rigid and straight. And if that were the case, it wouldn't have so many joints, it wouldn't articulate in so many different places. So probably like all of the cues that we'll talk about, I think I probably use that one sometimes. I don't have strong feelings either for or against it, but I would definitely be wanting to use it in the context of right now, do this, but in a minute, we're going to be doing something else. We'll be doing a lovely juicy side bend, or we'll be doing a spiral through the spine, or, whatever, we'll be rounding forward. Like, this is the thing I want you to do for now, but I don't want you to do that for always. Unfortunately, I don't have that kind of power and authority with my students anyway.
And again, going back to, a flat back is quick. And I think if you're the kind of teacher that teaches a faster paced power yoga or flow yoga, when you're in that sun salutation where it's really rhythmic, it's effective in that sense because it really keeps the pace and everyone knows where you're going. So it really does depend on who you're teaching, where you're teaching, what you're teaching, and that, I think, taking that into consideration as well.
And our next cue, Dana, is kind of related. If we're thinking about the forward fold of Uttanasana and the halfway lift, your next cue relates to, well, it's where I've most commonly heard it, from the transition from Tadasana down to that forward fold. So what's our next controversial cue?
So the next one is swan dive forward. So that relates to, as you said, coming from Tadasana down into Uttanasana. And this is a visual that for me personally doesn't work. But I can understand why it perhaps has become popular, because one, it sounds really graceful and really pretty, that idea of being able to, be like a swan as you come down. But what it can do, so it depends on the student again. So for some people, perhaps that are more stiff and have naturally more of that rigidity, perhaps it suggests a sense of more movement or more pliability as you want to come out of that, perhaps kyphosis, as we were talking about, and try to lift the chest. And maybe for some people, it can take them into neutral spine without necessarily taking them into lordosis in the lower back. But what you tend to see a lot with that cue is, because there are many people in yoga that are quite flexible in their hamstrings, and it does tend to bring people who are more flexible into that lumbar spine and accentuate the back bend there, which, as you're coming down into that forward fold and you've got the effect of gravity pressing down on your spine, we really need to be engaging the core through that transition to support all of that load. And the swan dive forward, if it does accentuate that curve in the lower back, is potentially counterproductive to being able to cinch in around the waist and feeling that three-dimensional core support, which is really important in that transition from Tadasana to Uttanasana. So it's not a cue that I really use ever. Actually, I can say that very confidently. I never say swan dive forward. What about you?
I don't really get away with any terribly poetic cues. There's just something about how I say them that people are like, what? They're like, paint a rainbow with your top hat. I can't get away with swan dive forward. I can't get away with. So I don't tend to use that one for that reason. It just doesn't ring true from me. And I have very mixed feelings about that transition, because you'll see in the population I teach, probably 2/3 of the population rounding their spine and kind of curling forward, 1/3 who are more flexible or maybe have heard that cue a million times, doing more of the really bright chest fold forward. And that's definitely my tendency. the issue for me when I do that is not so much that I'm concerned about the load on my low back, but it's that I'm in my habits and patterns. My ribs are flared out. I tend to lean back, hyperextend my knees. None of that's dangerous, but it's just not teaching me anything new. It's not challenging me out of my habits and patterns and making me more mindful in the way that I move. So if I'm teaching that transition, that's my focus for the class. I'm teaching that transition, and we'll spend a lot of time working through what a neutral spine is for each of us and how it feels to hinge at the hips and how far down we can hinge before we then round the spine. And if I'm not focusing on that, I just say inhale, reach up, exhale, bow forward, and I just leave it there. What
So
about you, Valerie?
Can I just jump in just one sec before we hear from Valerie? So just to unpack a little bit of what you said and elaborate, is that when you have that length in the hamstrings and you're doing that swan dive forward, you mentioned that you lean back, and then what potentially happens is that we're not actually using the strength of our legs in that transition. So being able to use the hamstrings and the glute max particularly to support the upper body in that transition. When we swan dive forward and you have that flexibility, you're probably using more just the flexibility of the hamstrings.
Totally.
So just to make that clear, what you meant about which muscles we're trying to recruit in that transition. So the leg,
and for
the
me,
hips,
when
and the
I
core.
swan dive, pretty much nothing. I'm just kind of using gravity and my postural habits and patterns to take me forward. And again, it's not an inherently horrible thing, but I'm just not teaching my body any new ways of moving.
I love that.
I love that too. I will confidently say I never use this, not because there's something wrong with it. I just similar to what Rachel said, I tend to be I'm a more flexible body, and I tend to then lay in the hamstrings, and it's not, for me personally, it doesn't encourage any mindful movement in that transition. And I think that is something that I love about the yoga medicine training, is that it does, we really do try to encourage that mindfulness through the transitions, that it's not just the pose itself, but the way we move in between the postures, and to encourage our students to find that integrity and that, kind of full body integration. And so I never use this. I can't, I think I was, it was told very explicitly to me that the reasons why I should not use this when I went through my own 200-hour. And so I just never do. I always say, just, forward fold.
Fold forward.
Fold forward. And then, obviously you're teaching to a variety of students, and some of your students are going to be more flexible bodies, and some of them are going to be more, tighter bodies. And so finding the way to speak to those students in ways that are meaningful and accessible to them, I think is valuable. And it takes some trial and error. And if you're moving through a sun salutation and you're trying to move quickly, it's different than if you're really taking a slower approach to moving a student into a forward fold, based on the theme and the intentionality of your class. So I tend not to use this personally.
I think that's a great point, that when you're moving students through a sun salutation, you've really got to pick your battles. And if you've got one specific thing that you're focusing on in class, you might be able to sneak that into the sun salutation. Otherwise, you're just moving people through space, letting them warm up and connect with their breath. And there's probably not time to unpack things in much more detail than that. And our next cue is yours, Valerie, or not yours, but yours to initiate conversation about. And it is
my
kind of
cue.
the opposite.
I own it.
We've talked about this kind of tipping forward, and yours is the opposite. Take it away.
It is. It's the cue, tuck your tail, which is not a cue that I tend to use, because I had a friend at one point who was taking a class, not a yoga class, but a different kind of class. And this cue was used over and over and over again. And she overdid it, she took it to the extreme, which I think is the possibility of when we say tuck your tail, students might take that very seriously. Work really hard to tuck their tail. We sometimes you might hear this in just standing at the in Tadasana at the top of your mat. You might hear it in something like Warrior Two or Goddess Pose.
Mhm.
You might even hear this in a bridge or a back bend. And so I think that for me, this is a challenging cue. I don't tend to use it. I tend to use things more like lengthen, like the flesh of your glutes, or something along those lines, because I don't want it to feel like this rigid have to, because when students do take that to to mean like 100% I have to tuck my tail, it has a cascade effect throughout the legs, throughout the torso as well. It can create flexion in the spine if we overdo it, and create that similar to that kind of activation of rectus abdominis. If we're really taking it to the extreme, it can also, if we're standing in Tadasana, it might cause the knee, you might have the knees start to bend because we've really trying to create that roundedness in the low back. And we talked about this before, like we want to encourage these natural curves. And so I think it can be overinterpreted and thus overdone when we really want to encourage our students to create this kind of three-dimensional support, which is going to require our core to be engaged, our legs to be engaged. And so, for me, I think this kind of goes back to the first cue that we unpacked, this navel to spine, where if you are teaching something along the lines of tuck your tail, or a cue that focuses on the pelvic loop, if you will, which is something that we go through in the 200, is this really kind of getting your students to this education to your students to understand what these cues mean, and then how they can, if they're overinterpreted or overdone, they can have this cascade effect on above and below. And how do we get our students to understand that when we're really just trying to find some length through the low back? We're still obviously encouraging a natural curve there, but wanting our students to just be mindful about really that three-dimensional activation of the core, and also using the legs, what's above and below, and the glutes, in a way that is integrated and not just focusing on this tucking of the tail, which can, I just find, be misinterpreted and overdone.
Mm. I think this one came from a phase of belief that too many people had anterior pelvic tilt, that too
Yes.
many people had a postural habit of the front of their pelvis tipping forward toward the fronts of the thighs. And so we should always correct that by bringing them back to neutral, by lengthening the tail and lifting the lower belly. And for some people, some of the time, I think that is really helpful. But like most things, you don't want to be stuck doing it all the time. And I do use that cue, just like navel to spine. I use it in really specific circumstances where I want people to create posterior pelvic tilt. So say the beginning of rolling up to bridge, and then I would have them come back down and do the opposite, tip the front of the pelvis toward the thighs, and then scoop their belly button toward their spine, tuck their tail, peel up. So I want people to sort of explore those positions. I might also use it in something like a lunge, where I'm looking for a stretch for the hip flexors, the psoas in particular. I might say, would I say tuck your tail there? I might say lengthen your sacrum. I might say lift your pubic bone toward your low ribs, but the same sort of intention of opening up the front of the hip of the back leg. But yeah, it's one that I use. It's one that I don't use in neutral poses. I don't use it in Tadasana. I don't use it in Warrior Two or Goddess. But I do if I'm looking for ways to encourage people to find a posterior pelvic tilt for a specific time, not forever.
Yeah. I love that. I do tend to also cue from the front of the body, that kind of curling pubic bone towards low ribs, is one of my go-tos. I like that one quite a lot. I also find one more piece on this, I think in back bends in particular, that this tucking of the tail can also, if you're in bridge and a student is really over tucking, it can cause that external rotation of the femur bone, and then just some extra information in the sacrum area. And so I think just and
very delicately put. Because
I
we're not
know,
even
well,
talking about whether to squeeze your glutes or not squeeze your glutes today. That one was
We'll
too
get
hot
there.
to touch, people.
Yes. So I think it can be educating your students as to what you mean by some of these cues and what you are trying to get them to feel or to think about. And knowing that there's going to be some trial and error. I tend not to use this one. Rachel just reminded me that I do tend to cue from the front side of the body usually because I don't want someone to overcompensate. What about you, Donna?
I use this one, like Rachel said. My favorite pose to use this one is in reverse tabletop or like once in a blue moon Purvottanasana, which I don't teach very often. But I had a long time ago had actually an assist in Purvottanasana, which is like reverse tabletop with the legs straight for those that aren't familiar with the Sanskrit. Actually had an assist. Rachel's very concerned. This was in
deeply
my
concerned
power yoga days where hands-on assist featured heavily in the practice. Anyway, it was very neutral. Let's just say the assist was very neutral, but it was before I really understood. I don't even think I was a teacher yet. It was before I really understood posterior, anterior tilting of the pelvis, and so I'm assuming that I was not doing posterior tilt of the pelvis, and the teacher helped me find that, and it just changed the pose for me dramatically. And I was like, oh, this feels great now. I used to just absolutely despise that pose. So for me, tuck of the tailbone when you're wanting to cue that pelvic loop and in the back bends, especially the initiation, is really helpful. I use it sometimes in bridge, but definitely in reverse tabletop. I love it because it is really hard to access that. I think when you're trying to lift up against gravity, it can be really helpful and make the lower back actually have that length that can feel really nice.
I think you've highlighted a really important point here, which is when an anatomical action or movement is unfamiliar to you, the cue might have to really highlight some activity, like lengthen your sacrum might not be enough if you don't know how that feels, whereas tuck your tail might give you the oomph to be like, oh, you really want to tuck that thing. And then once you've got the feeling, you don't have to be that aggressive about it next time. You could just lengthen the skin over your sacrum, as Valerie was suggesting. But if you don't know what that feels like or what that looks like or how you achieve that, you might need a more strident cue to get you started.
Yeah, I agree. And I think too, this cue, I think as yoga teachers, we also have a responsibility to monitor these trends and cues and, notice when a cue is being overused quite a lot by yourself and other teachers and the effect and impact that that's having. And I think this is one of those cues that people have really shied away from for a good chunk of years in recent times, and maybe is kind of people are like, oh, actually, maybe it's not so bad. We can bring it in specific places and can be really helpful. I don't use it in something like Tadasana. I grew up doing years of ballet and tucking my tail way too much. So definitely not teaching that in Tadasana. And I think too, we're in, it's kind of interesting now, I think, where we still kind of in society really engage and suck in the belly. But I also feel like people are also okay with having a little bit more of a curve on the posterior side these days. So
yeah,
I don't think naturally you see people standing there with their tail tucked under, perhaps as much as you did maybe 5-10 years ago.
I would agree.
So yeah, that's what I have to say about this one.
And you're now heading into the opposite one, Valerie. Your next cue is the opposite of tucking your tails. We've got lifting your sit bones or spreading your sit bones.
Yes, which, I think goes back and connects to a cue that Donna unpacked a little bit ago, the swan dive forward, and mentioned that, for some more flexible bodies, they tend to then scoot the hips back and kind of really lay in the hamstrings. And this one for me, I don't use this one often because I find like it's not an accessible one for me, especially when I was before I was a teacher and even like early on, what does that mean? Like, do your students know what the sitting bones are? If you've explained to them, maybe had them, do some self-palpation or something to understand what they are and give them some education around it. This one for me, I don't tend to use it. I also was teaching in a studio where there were a lot of flexible bodies. And this cue in particular for someone who is more flexible can encourage that kind of just laying in the joints and not facilitating that muscular integration and that mindfulness that we are trying to encourage in our students. So you might, hear this in a forward fold in particular, seated or otherwise. I've actually had, someone tell me to kind of like move the flesh of the glutes out of the way and spread through the sitting bones before you come into a forward fold, which, might be useful for some students, not so useful for others. I think, we do touched on this a little bit with the swan dive forward, so I don't want to belabor the point, but I tend not to use this cue because I think it tends to encourage the laying in the joints. But I think for some folks, especially tighter bodies, it might be useful if they understand what the sitting bones are. And if you're in down dog and you say lift through the sitting bones, that might be really useful for someone to kind of get that visual. I often say kind of like, think about sending your hips towards the point where the wall and the ceiling meet behind you so that there's this sense of elongation with a physical and, like accessible visual cue that they can think on and envision. So this is one that I tend not to use, probably because of my own experience as a more flexible person and not wanting to encourage those same kinds of habits in my students, I think.
I feel like we have a recurring theme here because I use this one too. I feel like pretty much every cue, I'm cue agnostic. I definitely don't use spread the sit bones. That's a little too graphic for me. I don't want to think about anything going on down there. But lift the sit bones, I would use exactly as you suggested in downward facing dog. So if I'm teaching a population where a reasonable percentage of people are kind of rounded in their back and really heavy on their hands, I might say drive your hands down and forward, lift your sit bones up and back. So there's more of that sort of that sense of elongation toward where the back wall and ceiling meet. And I also really like using an external cue, as you suggested, Valerie, as opposed to requiring people to think about what's going on in their bodies. I've also used that one, probably stolen from you, where the back wall and the ceiling meet.
I will, my answer is really similar to yours, Rachel. I don't tend to say spread. I do like the cue in downward facing dog. I do like to cue something about the sit bones. Sometimes I think it can get really lost on the majority of people because they don't know where their sit bones are. But for those that do, and if you can, I would probably use it in and then elaborate as to what I meant by that, or perhaps tied in with another cue around lengthening the lower back, or turning the hips to the back corner of the room. So very similar to what you said. I don't tend to use it in forward folds, especially not standing forward folds, just because really early on I had a studio owner who was doing my class, and she was an Ashtanga teacher with a hamstring injury, an old hamstring injury that had recovered, and so she really quickly explained to me how for people that had any kind of tendon type issues at the sitting bone that could be quite aggravating. She really turned me off from using that cue in forward folds, and rather instead going back to the swan dive thing again, and just teaching people to hinge from the hips before they get into that uttanasana can be just as effective.
Yeah, I don't worry, even though I have had hamstring tendon strain before. I feel like it comes from the pattern, the postural pattern, much more than any cue you could give. So the same way that you were saying, I would be kind of teaching the pattern or teaching a new way of moving, and probably not be laser focused on which cues I use. But that said, I don't use that one in standing forward folds. And I don't think I use it in seated forward folds either. I'm going to be really thinking about everything I say as I
I
teach for the
know.
next couple of weeks now. Like, oh my
Me
God, I
too.
do say that one.
But that's what I also love, like just to kind of chime in on the 200 hour. I love when we do run a 200 hour because there's always, every year, I feel there's an opportunity to refine, even when you've been
Hmm.
teaching for a long time. And so coming back to these basics and is really fun as a teacher to kind of go, ooh, what have I stopped saying? What am I saying too much? What's working? What's not? So it's really fun to have these conversations.
And whenever you gather new teachers in a room, I'll get a bunch of cues that I will then write down and steal that I'd never thought of saying it that way. I like that. I'm going to take that home and test it out. I think
Yeah,
you
I
have the
love
next
that.
cue, don't you, Dana? It is square those hips.
Hips
Square
Yeah,
those hips,
that's
baby.
square those hips. Okay, so we're going to talk about squaring your hips in something like Warrior One and Warrior Two. So again, this is a visual that can be really helpful for people to orient themselves on the mat. So generally, Warrior One is a forward facing posture, and Warrior Two is a side facing posture. So to say square your hips in Warrior One to the front of the mat is actually anatomically not very possible. So, because of the direction of the back leg, having that back leg extended behind you with the foot turned out on an angle, you're not going to get that. Say your left leg is in the back, you're not going to get that left hip facing the front of the mat with the right hip in the same way as you would in a crescent lunge.
Mhm.
So to tell people to square your hips in Warrior One, again, might bring some uncomfortable sensations to the sacrum and just cause like real discomfort in the hips for people. And also, you're asking them to do something that's not really possible, and then they can't do it, and that can lead to a cascade of experiences for them. So I think better to use the word towards, like square your hips towards the front of the mat, can just that little change in the cue can make a world of a difference for people, so they get the sense that it is a front facing posture and the torso is facing forward as well. And then what happens in Warrior Two, if we're saying square your hips to the side of the mat, is then now we get in the front leg, is we have external rotation happening in that hip. So to try to have the hips facing the side of the mat is again not going to be anatomically possible based on the rotations that we have in the legs. And so we'll start to lose some of that alignment in the front leg with the knee caving in as we try to kind of get that sense of that the hips forward to the side. And then the back hip as well, again, trying to get that one really facing to the side of the mat when you have internal rotation happening in the leg is just really not possible. So I do think these poses require the education and
Mhm.
the setup and taking your time to people who are new to it to explain what's happening in the legs, what's happening in the hips, where we want the torso facing. And as your students get more familiar with that, you can start saying like square your hips towards the front of the mat in Warrior One. I don't think I ever say square your hips in Warrior Two. Never. I never say that. How about you guys?
I tend to use square your hips when I really mean it, like bird dog, kneeling, opposite arm and
Yeah.
leg, square your chest and hips toward the floor, crescent lunge, square your chest and hips toward the front wall. I don't tend to use it anywhere else, but I do use the turn toward. In Warrior One,
Yeah.
turn your chest and hips toward the front of the room. Warrior Two, turn your chest and hips toward the side wall. And you're right. If you're going to go into more detail than that, then that really needs to be your focal point for the class, and you need to allow a little more time to elaborate. Keep the front knee where it is. Turn your hips as far as they comfortably go. You can then finish the job and turn your chest the rest of the way. But that's something that you can't say in every single transition, or you'd never get any yoging done.
True.
Yeah, I am the same. I don't have anything to add on this one. I use the word toward if I use it in Warrior One, if at all. But I tend to, if I'm going to use the word hip square, it's in similar instances like bird dog or something along those lines where it
Mhm.
is possible.
Yeah.
I know what you're saying, like with the warrior one, square your hips to the front of the room. If it gets people to turn, quickly set up in the shape, you're facing the front of the mat. That's where you want to go. And I think like the tuck your tail thing, it's like if you really start to notice that people are like trying to crank that back hip to really face the same way, that they're taking that cue to the extreme, then you probably need to pedal back from that.
Yeah, quicker just not to teach warrior one ever, I think.
I think that this also is a good reminder for us all, like just to really watch your students. You should be observing your students and checking in to ensure that your cues are meaningful and actually, creating what you're intending in the students. And if they aren't, then it's time to try something else or pivot and be nimble, find that ability to be nimble in your teaching and in your cueing in real time. And that is a skill that obviously needs to be practiced. But it is so important to watch your students and to observe them and see if your cues are actually landing in the way that you are wanting them to land.
And I think when you're a newer teacher, that can be so like it's item 38 on the massive list of things that you're trying to do in your class.
Yeah.
I mean, it shouldn't be. Obviously, watching your students should be really close to the top of the list. But God, when you're trying to manage the space and remember your sequence and get the cues out and make sure
just
the temperature and the music are
sometimes.
Exactly, just surviving without abject embarrassment. But I think what was really helpful for me when I was new was there'd be questions after class, and that would make me think, oh, I wonder if I was overemphasizing. Somebody says, I'm so bad at warrior one, I just can't get my hips square to the front of the mat. Do you have any suggestions for me? Might be a really helpful cue to, okay, I was creating an unrealistic expectation there. That's something I need to unpack a little bit with everybody. Because chances are somebody else went home thinking, gosh, I'm so bad at warrior one. When am I going to get my hips square to the front of the mat?
Yeah, you said that, Rachel, that, the perception that the students have when you give certain cues and then what they walk away with. And one thing that I used to do as a new teacher, actually, I still do this, is sometimes you could be watching your students, but the moment has passed, they're already done warrior one and you're maybe not going to get them back there again. And so I would kind of go, ooh, they really struggled with that cue this week. Like, let's talk about it next week. So you can feel as a teacher that, you haven't, hopefully most people are coming from more than one class, right? So you have a long-term education process that you can go through with your students. So you don't have to feel you have to clarify and get every cue right every single moment of the class. Because again, that's also setting yourself up for unrealistic expectations.
100% agree. And the next cue relates to standing poses as well. It's knees track with toes or knees stack over toes. And I think these are two slightly different cues that apply in slightly different places in standing poses. So I think about knees stacking over toes as the front leg of warrior two or warrior one or of a lunge, looking for this the sort of shin bones to be a sort of plumb line to gravity, where the knee is maybe not so much directly above the toes, but say above the ankle. And I think this cue is intended to create a pretty efficient transfer of load. Like gravity is traveling directly down the bone, so that in theory, there's a little bit less work for the muscles and the structures of the joint to do. I think the reason why this one is controversial is because I think sometimes it gets a little overemphasized, like the tuck your tail one or the navel to spine one. It can create this idea that the knees should always stack over the ankles and the knees should never go past the toes. Whereas I think anyone who's looked at their knees in daily life will notice that their knees go past their toes all the time. So this is one that I use because you've got to give students a general framework of the shape that they're finding their way into, but it's certainly not one that I correct. I'm not going to go around and make people move their knee back or move their knee forward. So if we're thinking about the front leg in warrior one or warrior two, the idea of the knee being directly above the ankle is probably going to be a pretty efficient cue for most of the people in the class. But because that's an efficient cue doesn't necessarily mean that not doing that is going to be harmful or dangerous It just means it might be a little bit less or a little bit more work. The knee behind the ankle is something that you don't hear people worrying about very often. But as soon as the knee starts to travel forward toward the toes or past the toes, I see some discussion around the potential for damage to the knees. And it's definitely more load for the knees, because instead of gravity traveling through bone, it's now traveling through the quadriceps and through the patellar tendon, which is where the quadriceps gather up and cross over the kneecap. Now, depending on who you're teaching, that might be a helpful thing to train, or it might be too much stimulus for the quads and the patellar tendon and the knee. As somebody who occasionally has knee pain when I walk downhill or walk downstairs, more load is not always a good thing. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. So this is one of those cues that I think is a generally helpful place to start getting people into a general outward shape. Step your front foot forward, stack your front knee above your ankle, turn your chest and hips toward the side of the room, reach your arms toward front and back walls, bang, you're in warrior two. Is it something that, is it a hill that I'm going to die on? No, I'm not walking around adjusting people's knees forward or back, because if they're experiencing load that's unpleasant or that they're not trained for, they'll feel it pretty quickly and they'll tend to self-correct. What are your thoughts on the knees over toes or knees over ankles one? Neither of you are looking particularly passionate about it.
I'm with you on this one, Rachel. I don't have
Yeah.
anything to add, honestly.
Yeah.
I think it's helpful in a beginner's class, again, because we're trying to teach a shape and get people to sort of know more or less where they want to be.
Yeah.
If they're new to warrior one or warrior two, like it's especially, they're just really unusual poses that most people, you might have encountered a lunge before in your life, like say in a gym or a physical education class, but warrior two is a pretty unusual thing. So I do think it can be helpful in a general framework to say, this is the shape, this is how we make the shape. But then for me, I actually spent many years like assisting before I started teaching. And this was like something that the particular studio was really big on, this like knee over the ankle. But you would just see so many people unable to be there. They just don't have the strength to be there. And it's way more comfortable for them to have the knee behind the ankle that way. I think for me, as I've developed over the years, like there's more interesting things to talk about, I guess,
Yeah.
in warrior two or warrior one, where I agree. I think people will put their knee relative to their ankle based on what's comfortable and how strong they are. And, sometimes I might cue people to come a little bit deeper into the lunge, but I usually get people to walk their foot forward first too, to create a wider stance before moving the knee forward. And I've just chosen to emphasize other things over the years.
I feel the same. And I think this one sometimes comes up in a low lunge when the back knee is on the ground. And I'm not even slightly bothered about how far forward your front knee comes in a low lunge, because a lot of your weight is transitioning through the back leg, through the back knee into the floor. So, even when I've had knee pain walking downstairs, I can I can bring my knee miles forward of my front ankle in a low lunge, because so much of the weight is mitigated by the back leg. So I'm not worried there. And the other place that I hear it sometimes is in chair pose, Utkatasana, of, look down over your knees, make sure you can see your toes. And I'm also not so fussed about where the knees are in this pose, because you're on two legs. So again, you're sharing the weight between 2 feet. And I just find if I shift my knees further forward, it becomes a little more quad dominant. I feel the fronts of the legs a little more. If I shift my knees and my hips back, then I tend to feel my glutes a little bit more. And so I would just kind of pick and choose depending on where I wanted to focus my effort or emphasis on the day, as opposed to being dogmatic over this is always the way that pose is done. The other side of that equation was the knees tracking with toes, and this one's slightly different. We tend to hear this cue when there's some rotation involved in the hips. And as a teacher, we're trying to get the student to rotate from the hip and just take the knee along for the ride, as opposed to rotating from the knee. And knees do have a little bit of rotation to them, especially when your knee is pretty deeply bent. You can actually rotate a little bit between the lower leg and the upper leg, but the straighter your leg becomes, the less rotation there is available, and the more the knee acts kind of like a hinge, just straight forward and back. And I think that's the intention behind that cue. So you might hear this relating to the front knee in Warrior 2, to keep your knee tracking with your toes as you turn your chest toward the side of the mat. You might hear it in something like horse or goddess pose, to turn your toes out and then to keep your knees tracking with your toes. Or maybe if you're in a lizard lunge, where you're in a low lunge but the front foot is wide, you might turn the front toes out and then track your front knee with your toes, with the aim of focusing the rotation on the hip joint, which likes rotation, and less so on the knee joint, which doesn't have as great a capacity for rotation. So that's the kind of thinking behind that one. And this is one that I will use sometimes, especially if it is my focal point for the class. So if I'm focusing on Warrior 2 and I want people to maximize the external rotation in that front leg, I'll have them watch the front knee, keep it tracking with the toes, pointing in the same direction, like the eyes of the knee are pointing in the same direction as the toes. See if they can feel the very bottom of their glute just to the outside of their sitting bone engaging. I might even have them self-palpate to feel that engagement, as if they're kind of pressing the outside of the knee toward the wall, and then see how much of that they can maintain as they turn their chest toward the side of the room. So kind of looking for those balanced opposing forces. That might be something that I cue if it's my focal point for the class. Otherwise, I think of this one a little bit like the previous one, where if it bothers people's knees, they will tend to self-correct. The only place I would tend to talk to the class as a whole is if I get the impression that they've got a feeling that the pose should look different to how it does in a normal body. For example, if I see everyone setting up for horse or goddess and they think their feet have to be at 180 degrees pointing to the front and back walls, and their hips don't have that rotational capacity, it'll be their knees kind of making up the slack. And then I might talk about knee tracking in terms of just find a comfortable turnout for your toes and bring your knees to match. Otherwise, it's not something I talk about a lot. Did I get too far into the weeds on that one? No? Thoughts?
So this for me was another light bulb moment in a yoga medicine training. So I think of knees that really like to rotate. Maybe they don't like to rotate, but they will rotate more first. Hip second. And yeah, actually had this pointed out to me in a yoga medicine training about my alignment. And so it was a real light bulb moment to also learn to use my external rotators and the, lower glute max, wake those muscles up. So they would have been just all those years of ballet and tucking the tail. So I do tend to cue this one when I see the, that knee caving in and something like Warrior 2. And I think it's a really great teaching point in Half Moon, and it's really challenging for a lot of people in Half Moon. So I, have been known to really break down Half Moon and go nice and slowly, because I think people can really learn the difference there and start to feel it, which is quite fun. So yeah, I do like that cue in when there's external rotation in the front leg.
And even you've picked up on something that I think is really important, that it's not about trying to tell students that they're either doing it right or they're doing it wrong. It's about noticing what our habits are, noticing what our tendencies are, and exploring, how does it feel if I don't do it like that? How does it feel if I do it like this? How does it feel if I do it from here? So I might talk about that in something like bridge pose, where often as people lift their hips and they can't see their knees will do all kinds of crazy things. They'll flare out or they'll roll in. And it's not that I think that there's anything horrific happening if they do those things, but I want them to try to explore what happens if you keep your knees tracking with your toes. What does that require from you? What new information does that give you? And I think that's for us, perhaps something that's really precious in our yoga practice is the opportunity to explore really mindfully. So
I love that.
Let's do one more, which is micro bend your knees. or elbows. This is one that is very close to my heart. This has definitely been a light bulb moment for me in my practice. We tend to hear this one, especially when that elbow or knee is loaded more than normal. So not just when you're standing in Tadasana, but say the front leg in Trikonasana or triangle, or the front leg in pyramid pose, Pajvakonasana, or say the bottom elbow in side plank, where we're loading the joint more than we might do in casual daily use. And I think the intention behind it is for people like me whose joints hyperextend, they go beyond a straight line of 180 degrees and kind of bow a little bit. The thought was that if I hyperextended with extra weight on the joint, I might damage the joint. I might overstretch my ligaments and perhaps destabilize the joint capsule. Now, I don't think that that happens as somebody who's been hyperextending my knees for 47 odd years now. I think they're pretty well adapted to that load. But that doesn't mean that I want to just keep doing the thing that I normally do. It's an opportunity for me to learn some new patterns and to learn to do something slightly differently. So for me, learning how to put a little bend in my knee, it might not even look bent from the outside, but it feels different to me, to force not just the top of the leg, the quadricep to engage, but also the back of the leg, the hamstrings to engage, creates a totally different feeling in that pose. And it's the same thing in my bottom elbow in side plank. If I hold just enough of a bend in that elbow that I'm forcing the muscles to work as opposed to the joint to work, it's a whole different experience. And so for that reason, I think it can be a really fun cue for more mobile students to play with. If that's your focal point for the class. If I'm doing something else in side plank, if I'm focusing on hip dips or something like that, I'm not really worried about whether my bottom elbow is micro bent. I'm just trying to move my hips smoothly and slowly and to get the muscles on the bottom side of the body to engage. But if it's something that I'm focusing on, I think for really mobile students, that can be helpful. And for students who are less mobile, it's probably what their joints are doing anyway, so not a big deal.
Yeah. This one was like a light bulb moment cue for me, because I don't feel like I have necessarily joints that hyperextend, but it just created so much more like information and muscle engagement, I think, and makes me more actually in my body in those shapes, as opposed to just kind of using my extremities almost like a pedestal. I feel my feet differently. I feel the way that if I'm in side plank, I feel my hand differently. It creates different sensations and keeps me really present in those poses more so than I would be otherwise, which I quite like, because it creates this mindfulness in this vinyasa practice that I think is really palpable to our students, and has just been kind of a light bulb moment for me, that particular cue. So I do use this one in certain places, just as you said.
Yeah. What about you, Dana?
Yeah, definitely the micro bend in the knee for me was a game changer. What I find tricky about this cue is, I think especially the micro bend in the elbows, perhaps there's been an overuse of this cue, and so a lot of people think they're hypermobile because they bend their elbows, and it's like what you were just saying, Valerie. They bend their elbows and they suddenly go, "Oh wow, that feels really great," or they bend their knee and they're like, "That feels really great," because they're turning on muscles that they weren't using before. And then they were walking away thinking like, I'm hypermobile, or there's something wrong with me and I can only do this pose if I do it in this way. And I think that it really needs to go along with perhaps an education, or the way that you deliver and offer this cue is about that mindfulness, and notice how it feels when you do this, or notice how it feels when you're not doing it, and choose for yourself, which one you prefer, as opposed to, I think what you hear or used to hear a lot is, if you're hypermobile, bend your elbows. And then people are like, well, am I? I don't know. And so then they bend their elbows.
What does that mean?
And they go, oh, well, then I am. And there's almost like a diagnosis happening there, which is really important that we stay away.
And you also give the people the feeling like, oh, I must always micro bend my knees. I can never hyperextend my knees. You kind of pathologize something that's completely normal to that person. And I think you've really hit on what I think the three of us love so much about yoga medicine is that we're not giving you a sort of cheat sheet or a list of cues that you can and can't use. It's all about the context of who you're teaching, what you're trying to communicate, what the focal point is. And it's always in the context of long-term ongoing education and conversation, where we're definitely not the quick fix people, are we?
Steep learning curve.
So maybe with our last couple of minutes, we talk about what kind of brought us to yoga medicine and what it is that we value so much about the philosophy of not just the 200-hour, but yoga medicine's training in general. Do you want to kick off, Dana?
Sure. I had the lucky fortune to meet Tiffany while I was actually doing my 200-hour through another school. And so we are very fortunate to start to get some of the seeds planted around the yoga medicine philosophy. There wasn't actually even yoga medicine just yet, but it was the beginnings of it. And for me, was the understanding of the anatomy, the real thorough deep dive education into anatomy to understand, our bodies, and therefore taking that anatomical foundation into the teaching of yoga. So to understand the differences between the bodies and having that real sense of why, why do we use these cues and when to use them and when they will work. And that for me was a real game changer, because prior to that, I was teaching in a more dogmatic way, in a way that was like, well, you do it like this every single time, and not really understanding why I was doing it. So it opened me up to be able to teach, in different ways and to different people, and to find my own voice as well within being a teacher. So yeah, that's how I found yoga medicine, and that's just a little snippet of why I love it. I could go on, but I'll hand it over.
What about you, Valerie?
Oh gosh, I could go on and on as well. I found yoga medicine when I was looking for a 500-hour program, and had been researching, as I tend to do. I'm a scientist, so I like all of the. I like to do the research, and it just felt like I then went and took like a weekend with Tiffany, and she was visiting the area where I lived, and I went and did this 3-day weekend with her, and I just kind of fell in love with the whole approach. And just on that weekend, I think after the first class, which was like a core class or something, where she really broke down, got this kind of anatomical in an hour and a half, it was. There's this lecture, and then we did a practice, and I felt like, oh, this is it. This is perfect. And I think my first module was a sequencing module, and then I also did the spine. And I think for me, it just like Donna, like having that really solid anatomical focus really opened doors to help me teach in a very different way, and sequence a class in a different way, and be really just thoughtful in kind of step by step, kind of leading a class through a themed class, maybe on a particular anatomical region, or towards a specific pose. Or it just gave me a lot more freedom, I think, and but yet grounded in this sense of knowledge and foundation. So there, I don't know if that makes sense, but just the anatomical focus for me was really strong, or really important. And that has opened up doors for me to just teach in a different way, find my own voice. And that's interesting, because I think the three of us all are, yoga medicine trained, and then, but to take each of our classes would be very different, because there is that sense of feeling really empowered in what you teach, based on the content, but to find that individual variability and to feel empowered in that, and to teach in a way that really serves you, but also is able to teach the content in a way that is really accessible, and efficient. And I don't know. I just, it's been, I mean, and the community, the yoga medicine community was also a really big draw as well. So
You've hit
I
on a
can
lot
just
of the
add in a
themes.
word.
Yes.
Yeah, I think confidence. It gives you
Yeah.
confidence because you understand what you're doing, and
yes,
Why?
you feel like you can adapt to whoever's in front of you, and that's probably why we all, people get into teaching yoga, is because you want to share this amazing practice.
Yeah. Yeah, that was what really resonated for me. I was looking for a 500 hour the same way that Valerie was, but I'm not a scientist, so I didn't do any research. I just picked something and went to it. And Tiffany was there co-teaching, and she was so different from what I had been exposed to, which was a very charismatic, a very kind of powerful and exciting teacher that I felt I would never be able to be. I'm not spiritual enough. I'm not potent enough. I don't kind of stride into a room and immediately capture everybody's attention. And Tiffany was just so knowledgeable, but so humble and so focused on the content and so unfocused on herself and her own personal power that it really made me feel, as Dana said, confident that I could teach as myself in my own words, in my own way, and still get the message across, communicate the things that had been so important to me. And I didn't have to be anything more than what I was. And that to me was all I needed, morning one, day one, signed up for the 500 hour and have never looked back.
That was a great training.
It is. And for those of you who are already in the 500 hour, do feel free to share this with anyone you think might be interested in the new online yoga medicine 200 hour that we're launching in just a few weeks. We'll link to the course page in the show notes. Anything you want to leave people with, Dana, to get them excited about the 200 hour?
I'm excited for this format. I know there's lots of people that have wanted to do the yoga medicine 200 hour, where the travel and the commitment to that was too much. And so the accessibility of this training and the length of time too, so that it really easily fits into, you need 6 hours a week to, stay on track with the coursework. So it runs from March to December, very first week of December. Lots of accountability and connection with live calls with the three of us. It's going to be fantastic. I really just can't wait.
Woohoo! I think that's exactly the right note to leave it on. Thank you both so much for sharing your thoughts and your experiences, and let's do it again.
Let's. Much more to cover.
100%.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you liked the show, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com. Check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine, or you can email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being part of our yoga medicine community.
The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.